Welcome to Leaders and Laggards.
Hello there. Welcome to episode 10 of Leaders and Laggards. I'm Jeff Custer, and I'm here with Dave Swenson and Ken Riches. Welcome back, guys. I'm excited to have our conversation tonight. Last week, we had a really good conversation about teams and effective ways to build teams, and wanted to continue on that theme and talk a little more this week about teams. But maybe some of the things that happen inevitably probably to every team that leaders need to know how to work their way through. And was really basing this off of a book that was written about 20 years ago called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And one of the 5 dysfunctions is the fear of conflict. I have a few questions I wanted to ask you guys tonight about how conflict happens and how it's resolved within teams. And a little story before I ask you guys the first question. I used to lead a team, and we were in an environment where, as a team, we had to rate our employees. It's kind of like year-end stuff for pay raises. You guys may have been in those environments. And we'd get together as a leadership team, and individual managers would have to rate their employees, and it drove what their pay raises were going to be. So it was real money. And one of the things that would typically happen is everybody would agree in the meeting room with what was talked about. And then usually half the managers would come see me afterwards and say, I didn't agree with that. That was not the right thing to do. And it was always, why didn't you bring it up while we were there? And It really gets to this concept of fear of conflict. So the first question I've got tonight is, why do people fear conflict? Dave, can you start us off with that one?
Yeah, I'll take a whack at it. And I know we had based kind of the conversation on the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And I think it's a great book. I think Patrick, I'm not sure if he pronounces that last name, Leonconi or something like that. But
yes.
Yeah, however you pronounce it, right? I think he's got some good ideas and points. I describe things a little bit differently than he does, but so I think why we tend to be afraid of, or why people tend to fear conflict, is that we've all probably been involved in, or at least witnessed a conflict, whether it was actually perceived. And in the course of that conflict, if we were involved, likely what happened was when things got important, or when they got we got to the meat of the matter of the conversation, that primeval notion to either fight, flight, or freeze took hold. And so when that occurs, inevitably what either is going to happen is we're either going to leave with an unresolved conflict, which isn't necessarily good. But the other thing that can happen in that instance is, sometimes I refer to it as people tend to release that inner honey badger. And when that occurs, right, maybe we do things or we say things that we really wish we hadn't. So past experience is probably one of the reasons that we fear conflict. And so we've really got to work at a more evolved response, other than the primal fear of flight, fight, or freeze. That's my opinion.
Ken, what would you add?
Yeah, I look at it as a little bit more. I mean, I agree with everything that Dave said. I think that one of the things is that conflict is difficult, and it puts people outside their comfort zone. And there's the fact that asserting your opinion can be scary, and that it'll have a negative connotation and might come across as antagonistic. You want to be, most people when they go to work, they want to be perceived as nice. And I think it just really is that it all comes down to is that there's a fear of disappointing others.
Yeah, and Dave and I are here in Minnesota. We know all about that Minnesota nice.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, and I think maybe a little different twist. I think you guys, we're like usual. I think we're on the same page. I think part of it gets down to some people just are. They're afraid that people aren't going to like them if there's a conflict. Somehow we can't disagree with and leave being friends. I think that's one of the things you see in our society. We've kind of devolved into that, where conflict means I have to hate you. Well, no, it doesn't have to, but people kind of get that mentality. So I think there's a little bit of fear of not being liked. And I think leaders are maybe not all that well skilled at how to work through there, Dave, like you said, the fight or flight. And if you're not prepared for the conflict, that's probably going to be your reaction, is I'm going to fight, which doesn't turn out well, or I'm going to just run away, which leaves the conflict for another day.
Right.
And I think the last thing is, that came to mind for me is, why do people fear conflict? It's like, well, I don't want to deal with that, so it'll just be easier if we avoid it, and we'll worry about it later. And you guys know how that probably turns out. It
Right.
likely makes the situation worse down the road. So, second question that I've got for us to talk through tonight is, what are the consequences if teams don't do a good job working their way through conflict? Ken, what are the consequences? What happens to the team?
I think that has the number one is that it has a tendency to diminish trust.
Yeah.
And animosities might develop. And if there's incompatible goals and there's a sense of that it's going to be a win or lose, that's destructive. And it can cause discord, disharmony, hostility. Bottom line for an organization is, I think, that productivity is going to suffer.
Dave, what would you add?
Well, I'd say that this ends up being being in our line of work, right? Or at least the line of work that I do, a lot of times we're going to talk about the consequences of leaving conflicts on the table. And I always tell people that, think of it this way: conflicts are not like wine; they don't get better with time. So you kind of have to deal with them, because if you don't deal with them, what can happen is, certainly we can have two individuals that maybe are in conflict with each other, and that could drag down the performance of those two individuals over the course of time, right? But if those people are in leadership roles, we may be in a situation where there's entire teams, divisions, could be plants, whatever, they're in conflict with each other, just simply because the two leaders haven't ever resolved the conflict. So my advice to people would be, don't neglect the growth opportunity that conflict actually is providing you, because if you can develop a more evolved way of managing and de-escalating conflict, there's a lot of opportunity to not only grow yourself, but those, trust with your team, trust with your peers, so on and so forth. So you're robbing yourself a lot of opportunity if you just let conflict fester.
Yeah, Ken, my list I put together, I was with you. I think you see decrease in trust level, that probably, and I think then things start compounding on that. It's, you start seeing morale go down, and like you said, productivity goes down. Maybe you even start to see a lot of stress. And especially, Dave, I think you see the stress start ratcheting up, especially when it's that unresolved conflict. That's just kind of that undertone of conflict that exists in, like you said, different organizations. Everybody knows it's there. People don't want to address it. And it really ramps up the stress, and probably ultimately, that's a toxicity in an organization that probably leads to a lot of turnover. People just aren't going to stay if they're in that environment. And so, pretty expensive consequences to an organization if you have all that unresolved or all that conflict going on where people are leaving. So I think the first two questions to me were maybe the softball questions that are pretty easy for us to kind of pin those things down. Why do people fear it? What are the consequences? Probably the hard part, and the part where we can really give some insight to viewers is, how can we as leaders move organizations, move our teams from having that fear of conflict to where we're having healthy debates. And so I'm just really curious for you guys to flesh that out. How do we make that transition? If there's a team, if you're leading a team that's got these problems we've talked about, how do you get over that, Dave?
Well, I'll try not to run at the mouth too long here, guys. But I get kind of passionate about this one because it just comes up so often, right? So one of the things I guess I'd give as a recommendation is just to remember that conflict as a rule or the roots of conflict are pretty predictable, which means that we can be pretty proactive in the way that we manage, resolve, or even sidestep conflicts before they even can occur. So, one thing that can definitely create conflict is we all have this inner, I'll call it a emotional contract that we carry around with us. And it's our beliefs about the way that we should be treated and our expectations of others. But the funny part is we don't share that with people, right? So if anybody here is old enough to remember the Shoot Us with John Wayne, right? He came out and he said, I won't be wronged, I won't be insulted, I won't be laid a hand upon, and these kinds of things. And it's I don't do this to other people, and I require the same from them. And so many of us have our own personal emotional contract. It's probably not like John Wayne's, but you need to share that with people rather than getting upset with them because they crossed the line with a contract that you never even shared, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing to keep in mind. But I guess there's so many of these conflict resolution models out there. And I remember vividly sitting down with a client, probably 2015, 2016 timeframe, and they rolled out this booklet of all these conflict resolution models that they tried. I believe there was 50 of them in the book. And I was like, okay, people, let's just go with something that works. And so I don't know if either of you have ever watched this gentleman. He did a TED Talk, and we've done some other things on YouTube. His name is Kwame Christian.
I've not seen him.
Well, I'll maybe forward the YouTube video to his TED Talk, but he teaches this model that's called compassionate curiosity. It's a 3-step method, the way that he teaches it. And I've kind of stole shamelessly from him and added a 4th step where we try and learn from the conflict, because I thought that was the only thing he was really missing. But it's short, it's concise, it's easy to learn, it's common sense. So those would kind of be my quick points. Is just realize that some of the conflict we're bringing in because we're not bothering to tell people what our expectations are or understand what their expectations are. But then when that inevitable conflict does happen, if you want to be able to do more than fall back on fight, flight, or freeze, you have to practice something. So practice this. I think Kwame's compassionate curiosity is a great model to become really adept at, and that should be your first step. Is how do I partner with you to work our way out of this with some not only compassion, but how can we both learn, right? So I'll leave it there. There's other stuff that I could go to too, but I don't want to run my mouth for a half hour and you guys.
All right, Ken, how about you? What are your recommendations for listeners to move from fear to healthy debate?
Yeah, I think in listening to what Dave was just saying, I would sum up some of that as there needs to be a culture and a philosophy that you refuse to be offended. I mean, being offended, and that is part of what creates the conflict. So if you go into the meeting or the situation and you're going to look for a common goal, or you're going to seek information and try and listen to the issue and ignore the delivery, that's going to really help you get to the point where you're not going to be offended by what's going on. And that helps you reemphasize the commitment to your organizational goals. It helps you focus on better decisions. And I think a key part of this is is to seek more information and to arouse creativity and all of that. And if you can help instill this type of a culture within the team, and they can get to the point where they're going to refuse to be offended, then you can really facilitate employee growth, which is really kind of, at the end of the day, one of the main things we're trying to do as leaders.
Yeah, Ken, kind of what I heard you say is, need to practice our active listening, which is just an essential tool for this and many other things. And then, in my words, I wrote down, I think just echoing you, it's not personal. And I think that's kind of like I mentioned before. I think that's one of the things is that people have come to think that conflict is just personal, that because we disagree, I somehow hate you. And, it just doesn't have to be that way. You kind of have that culture of respectful challenge. I can challenge you. I am listening. So, kind of that, I think I love that saying, before you want to be understood, seek to understand. If you have a team where all the members have that mentality, you're going to eliminate a lot of that. The things that I thought of that I would add that I think have worked well for me. I think it's good if you're a leader and kind of the thing I described at the beginning of a real world conflict I've been in. I think when I first got in those situations, Dave, I think I was probably in I'm going to avoid this conflict and maybe it'll kind of work itself out.
Yep.
And after I went through that a couple of times, I realized that's not going to happen. And I decided I need to do something different. This needs to change. And I think a couple of things I did in addition to the wonderful things that you guys mentioned was before we got into that situation where I knew there was going to be conflict, I brought it up. I said, this is probably going to involve some conflict. And we just acknowledge it, kind of that elephant in the room. You just put it on the table. There's going to be conflict and it's okay that so I think you can kind of prepare your team that it's going to be there. And then kind of going to the team norms that I think you guys mentioned, let's put these norms around how we're going to have this conflict. And then the other thing that I like to do is when it's done, regardless of how it turned out, whether you had a great debate and came to a good conclusion, or whether you kind of still had conflict, challenge the team. How did it go? How did we do? We said there was going to be conflict. We got all done. How did we do it? Work on our way through that and kind of make the teams be self-reflective of their part in that event. And those were a couple of things I've done. And, kind of going back to my example, it's still a struggle. It's still conflict, but I think as we talked about last week, you have those 4 stages of team development. The higher you can get your team on those stages, the more effective they're going to be at working through these conflicts. So those were our 3 questions tonight. So Ken, I'll maybe come back to you. We always like to give everybody like a final word for the night. And what's your final word for the listeners today?
It's okay to have passion, and that's really necessary for what you're doing and what you're trying to do. But the important thing is to make sure that you're respectful of others. And if you refuse to be offended yourself and you can model that role, then you can help others too. But it's just passion is great, but it's got to be done with respect.
Wonderful. Dave, last word from you tonight.
I guess last word would be, don't be surprised if you're better at conflict resolution in your professional life than you are in your personal life. Because it tends to, I know it's, that's the rule for me. And I think that's because, as those relationships are more personal, right? More, maybe they matter more to you, your wife, your kids, those kinds of things. There's more risk in the outcome of the conflict. So I know myself personally, I wish that I did more of what I tell people to do and try and do professionally.
Practice
yeah.
what you preach, Dave, right?
Yeah. And I absolutely do in my professional life, but I'll be honest and say, when it comes to the home life, I've got some work to do.
Yeah. And my suspicion is most of the leaders listening, we whether you're listening or the 3 of us, I would say we probably always have work to do. We can always do this better than we're doing it today. Even just preparing tonight, it was like, oh, there's a few things that I need to continue to work on to try to get better at this as a leader. So, one of the things that I would encourage the listeners here, kind of as last word for me, is practice. Don't look at these events that maybe I described as a one and done, never a chance again, but you can practice and continue to push yourself to get better. So thank you, listeners, for joining us tonight. This is our 10th episode of Leaders and Laggards, and we're glad that you're here to spend this time with us, and we will see you next week.
Thanks for watching, and remember, leadership matters.